And so you see Jesus, the whole time he's suffering all this horrific pain, who's he thinking about? He's thinking about the crowd. He's thinking about the thief. He's thinking about his mother. And even if we jump to Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2, it says, "Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross." So the joy that was set before Jesus was what he was doing on the cross, which was saving all of us who will believe in him. And does he know all of us who will believe in him as a blob of humanity, or does he actually know each one of us by name? He obviously knows each one of us by name. And so the idea then that Jesus on the cross, suffering the worst pain human beings have ever devised to torture somebody to death, and yet he's praying for the crowd, he's ushering a thief into heaven, he's taking care of his mom, and he's even thinking about you and me. If he's doing all of that, who is he not thinking about? He's not thinking about himself.
Hey, we're back here with Scott O'Malley. Going to be chatting about kind of a follow-up to our previous conversation on pride. And today we're going to be talking about how do you identify pride? What would be some signs? And then also a follow-up to that would be, how do I grow in humility? What are some practical ways that I can be putting that on and putting off pride? So thanks for being back here with us, Scott.
Thankful for the opportunity.
What are some of the telltale signs that Parker, that anyone is struggling with pride as a particular struggle for them?
Yeah, great question. What are some particular, manifestations of pride? Again, we all struggle with it to a degree. I think we kind of touched on that last time. We all have that struggle, and we're all going to fight against it until we make it to heaven, where we'll be free from pride. But until then, we need to be aware of it. And so some of probably the most obvious ways which we can see pride, one would be kind of a looking down on others, a critical spirit towards other people. If you find yourself always critical of people and looking down on people, thinking you're better than other people, that would be a form of pride. You see that in Luke 18 with the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. The idea of this guy who says, "God, I thank you, I'm not like these other people." And that's the evidence. That's massive pride. Usually most people aren't quite that blatant, but that's an example. But if you even have subtle thoughts of feeling better than other people, that's a warning sign of pride. And as Christians, we really shouldn't see ourselves as better than other people. We want to recognize we're sinners just like everybody else. The difference between a Christian and a non-Christian is a Christian recognizes his or her need and turns to Christ for forgiveness. It's not that we're better than other people, so we ought not look down on anybody, even somebody who struggles with significant sin problems or, dysfunction in their home or whatever else. And so that would be the first one that comes to mind there, kind of looking down on people, critical of others. Another one would be, honestly, never acknowledging your own shortcomings, right? Where I've counseled lots of people who talk about their parents growing up, and they'll say things like, "My dad or my mom never admitted they were wrong." If you never admit you're wrong, that is significant pride, because we are all imperfect, all of us. And so if you never admit you're wrong, that's a major problem. Matthew 7:3-5 comes to mind, where it talks about take the log out of your own eye before you take the speck out of somebody else's. So there's the idea there is you're supposed to make a big deal about your own sin and a much lesser deal about somebody else's sin or shortcomings. And so if you find yourself flipping that, where you make a big deal out of other people's sins and a little deal about your own sins, that's pride in action. That's pride showing itself in your life. And then just one other one I'll mention. There's honestly hundreds we could go through and spend the whole time just talking about all the manifestations of pride. But maybe the last one I'll mention that I think is also really important in this day and age in our culture is we want to take the place of God by defining what is right and wrong. That is such a significant area of pride in our culture.
Yeah. That's really good. On the first one, I was thinking, would you say that being easily annoyed is that kind of, what was the first thing you said? Is
overly critical. Overly
critical, which is kind of another way of that is like, man, everybody drives me nuts, or which makes me think of maybe being easily offended too. Is there connections there?
Yes, absolutely. And so we want to be gracious. Somebody might do something that is, unpleasant or uncomfortable or unwanted, but we ought to have a gracious disposition towards that. Here's the perfect example for all of us. Somebody cuts you off when you're driving, right? That's not comfortable. We don't like that. But if we get hostile and enraged and mean-spirited about that, that is a form of pride, because we've all driven imperfectly and maybe changed lanes when we shouldn't have and all that kind of stuff. And so there's a spirit of humility that ought to keep us from being easily offended or easily irritated and those kind of things, for sure.
A follow-up to that is, I've seen and I've been around, and maybe I'm sure I have this, I think we probably all do, and probably are somewhat blind to it, but I've experienced being in situations where there are people that have almost what I would call a secondary code, whether you want to call it etiquette or maybe it's cultural, right? But like the right and wrong is kind of superseded the Bible a little bit. And maybe this is going back to that, and it's like, you shouldn't do that, or you should do that. And then you kind of feel like you're on eggshells around them. What comes to mind when you're dealing with, does that make sense?
Those of us who've added a bunch of rules and regulations that we want to issue edicts on other people's lives and call that immoral, then that would be a form of pride. That's being like a Pharisee. You're adding rules to the Bible that God never commanded. Now, it's okay to have preferences for your household. For example, if I go to somebody's home and they ask me to take my shoes off, they prefer that. I should be gladly willing to defer to that person and take my shoes off for their comfort, but that shouldn't be viewed as a moral thing. So if they view walking in the house with shoes as immoral, then that would be a judgmental person. Just like if I walk into someone's home and they want me to take my shoes off and I judge them and think this is ridiculous, that's a form of pride again as well.
But what about when there's mud? Sorry. What about when there's mud on their shoes?
Again, the person with the dirty shoes should be willing to gladly take their shoes off for the preference of somebody else. And so just the idea of not adding moral law above the Bible, it's okay to have preferences and house rules. Those are perfectly fine. But making those moral laws it would be a form of pride. And that's what the Pharisees did in the New Testament, where they added things to the law that obviously Jesus was working to undermine and upset them, because he wanted to help them to see their sin by adding rules that were not biblical.
See, babe, it's not a moral issue.
What's that?
It's just not a moral issue. My friends will make fun of me because I like to use that phrase a lot. I'll say, I think that this would be a good idea, but it's not a moral issue. And I just use it. I probably overuse that phrase, but like you're saying, it's not a moral issue.
That's right.
Scott, maybe this is the same question that we asked, but in my mind, it's a little bit of a different angle on it. So obviously you have been in a lot of different counseling situations, a lot of different marriage counseling situations, some other, relational counseling situations. And when would you say, obviously, well, I don't know if this is obvious. I think that generally speaking, when it comes to personal growth or spiritual growth, I think not many people can focus on 18 different sins at once and say like, oh, I'm going to go after this, 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 right? Like generally speaking, most people are usually fighting hard to put to death a specific sin. Now, maybe sometimes it needs to be like 2 or 3, but for the most part, like most people are generally, I think, going to be focusing on like one issue at a time. When would you say that it's a good indication that the sin that we need to be focusing on putting to death in this relationship, or like obviously like in this specific person, is pride?
Yeah. Well, I think that the way I would probably say it is, so I'm going to leave the subject of pride to answer that. I think pride is an ever-present problem for everybody. And I would want to find out what is the thing that they want the most that they're not getting that leads them to respond with pride, if that makes sense. So, for example, if a person has what the Bible calls the fear of man, and they're desperately always wanting everybody to compliment them and praise them and tell them how great they are, that's a form of pride. But I wouldn't so much focus on helping them overcome pride as overcome the fear of man, of overcoming their desire for affirmation and helping them to see that their affirmation is a gift that they receive from God because of the merits of Jesus Christ. And when they are satisfied and content in who they are in Christ, they will actually overcome that desire for affirmation, and they will have victory there. And that, as a result, is giving them victory over pride. So pride is kind of a primary manifestation for all of us. And so I would want to identify this specific flavor of pride, the specific form of pride, and help them with that. And that would indirectly help them with their pride.
So would that lead us into our next question, which is, how do we grow in humility? Is that one of the ways that you would say that you would encourage people to grow in humility, is identifying those primary desires? It was primary desires that you said, right?
That's right. Yep. Yes. Yeah. I think that's a great way to think about it. It's a primary desires, and it really flows into this idea of again, like we kind of touched on last time, this idea of focusing on God and other people. Okay. When you're focused on God and other people, blessing other people, giving to other people, you're not nearly as concerned with receiving from other people. See, if I'm thinking about how you're supposed to compliment me, I'm looking for you to give to me. But if I'm actually thinking about God and how God has already given to me wonderful affirmation through my relationship with Jesus Christ, and how he loved me so much, he sent his son to die for me. If I think about that, and then I also think about, actually, the person in front of me is actually more important than me, and I want to think about how can I give to that other person, I am overcoming this desire for affirmation by receiving it from the Lord, and then being a blessing to you, looking to give to you rather than receive from you. So that would be kind of a very helpful, really big first step in this idea of overcoming whatever sin struggle is in the way. And that's just one example. Another way to really have victory over pride and self-focus and self-exaltation, the things, again, we talked about last time, is to really, of course, look to Christ again. And of course, Jesus is always the perfect example for us. But I'd love for us to think about for a moment Jesus on the cross. And he modeled for us perfectly this picture of humility. Again, humility is this idea of being forgetful of self. And so let's imagine and remember, not imagine, but let's remember Jesus when he was suffering on the cross. In Luke chapter 23, verse 34, we read and we see that Jesus prayed, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they were doing." So Jesus is suffering this significant, horrific pain, and he's praying for the crowd that hours earlier had yelled, "Crucify him." And then a little bit later, same Luke 23, we read about Jesus talking with the two thieves. The one thief says to Jesus, "Hey, Jesus, get us down from here." The other thief says, "Hey, leave him alone. He hasn't done anything wrong." And then Jesus says, then he says to Jesus, "Remember me when you enter into your kingdom." And then Jesus responds and says, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." That's in Luke 23, verse 43. And so you have this picture then of Jesus suffering this horrific pain, and yet he's praying for the crowd. He's ushering a thief into heaven. And we also read in John 19, verses 26 and 27, how Jesus looked out into the crowd at the same time, again, suffering horrific pain. And he looks out and he sees his mother, Mary. Her husband is almost certainly dead. He was a righteous and godly man. That's why he was chosen to be Mary's husband. And yet he's around when Jesus is 12 years old and gets left at the temple. But when Jesus starts his earthly ministry at around age 30, there's no mention of Joseph. And the only logical explanation is he's dead. And Mary, a woman in their culture at that time, has no means to own property. She can't really provide for herself. Jesus is the oldest son in a Jewish family. And he looks out into the crowd and sees his mother and says to John, his most trusted disciple, "John, this is your mother. Mother, this is your son." And from that day forward, Mary went to live with John. And so you see Jesus, the whole time he's suffering all this horrific pain, who's he thinking about? He's thinking about the crowd. He's thinking about the thief. He's thinking about his mother. And even if we jump to Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2, it says, "Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross." So the joy that was set before Jesus was what he was doing on the cross, which was saving all of us who will believe in him. And does he know all of us who will believe in him as a blob of humanity, or does he actually know each one of us by name? He obviously knows each one of us by name. And so the idea then that Jesus on the cross, suffering the worst pain human beings have ever devised to torture somebody to death, and yet he's praying for the crowd, he's ushering a thief into heaven, he's taking care of his mom, And he's even thinking about you and me. If he's doing all of that, who is he not thinking about? He's not thinking about himself. And so this is a perfect example in the flesh. This is humility in action. Humility in action is this beautiful picture of Jesus on the cross, all the while suffering and yet thinking of everybody but himself. Because as we know, because of the power of Jesus, we know the nails is not what kept Jesus on the cross. It was his love for us that kept him on the cross. And so again, he's thinking about everybody but himself, again, modeling for us the perfect picture of humility. So now applying that to ourselves, that's how we need to grow. We need to be thoughtful. We need to be mindful. Jesus was doing what he was doing on the cross because that was the will of his Father. And so he's mindful of his Father. He's going to obey his Father perfectly. And then he's also mindful of all the people he's serving by what he's doing. That's how we overcome pride, as we think about God, we remember what God has said to us, we follow after him, we obey his commands, and then we also seek to bless other people, give to other people, serve other people, not get from other people, let them serve me and compliment me and praise me and make me feel good. That's the opposite of humility.
After having just gone through the season that I did with my health and thinking about how difficult it is in those seasons when you're hurting, when you're in pain, to think about other people. It's just so easy when you're in pain, because pain sort of like is its own reminder of yourself, right? Because you're feeling it, and pain in its essence is just something that doesn't really, it doesn't wax. I mean, it can wax and wane, but it's just kind of there, right? It's not like it's going away. It's not like you can put it away for 20 minutes and come back and, you know, like, oh, now I've got 30 minutes of pain and like, oh, I've got an hour off. Like, you don't get a break from pain. And to think about the immense pain that Christ was in on the cross, and that in that pain, he was thinking about other people. Like, it's just, for me, a very, you know, poignant word picture.
If I think back about, you know, Hope being sick, and it started roughly in July of last year, and I think back about those months, and as we told you, you know, I ended up stepping back from work and kind of made taking care of Hope my full-time job. And I wonder how this just ties in with what you were saying here too, but it seems like, you know, Jesus knew his identity, right? He knew his role. When I think about what you just described there, that's somebody who's incredibly committed to a job, if you will, right? Like there is a I know what I am what I'm called to do, if you will, right? And I think that one of the ways that God really encouraged me, and I obviously didn't do it perfectly, but I remember waking up every day and thinking, and it was incredibly helpful to commit to taking care of Hope versus trying to be a business owner and trying to take care of Hope. And that's part of where God first came from. And the belief in this is that if you don't know your priorities, when you wake up in the morning, you're going to be really conflicted. What do I do today? Well, I knew that I needed to love God, and I needed to love my wife, then my family, and then my business. And my wife needed me. So knowing and being committed to that role, I just think about our world. I feel like today screams what I deserve. You deserve this. I had people tell me last season, you know, Parker, you deserve, you know, some time for yourself, or you deserve, you know, whatever. And I'm like, I don't really deserve anything, is what I felt. And I remember thinking, that's actually not helpful for me to think about what I deserve, because it doesn't matter what I deserve. I need to take care of my wife. And so I don't know if you can bounce off of that, just kind of what.
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts. Thank you. That's a great example, a great story, and a reminder. So first of all, again, what we all deserve, don't move past the gospel. What we deserve is punishment in hell forever because of our sin. That's what we deserve. So this idea that you deserve better is not true. It's not biblical. But I understand the sentiment. And so a more helpful response, I would say, than telling you deserve better, because I don't think that's accurate. But a more helpful thing to say, which I think was evident in what you're describing, is God's grace is sufficient for you, and his power is made perfect in weakness, 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And so that's the picture there. So when you were clear in what you had to do, and God honored that, and he gave you the grace that was needed to handle that particular trial. Now, you're not always going to need that amount of grace. And so you won't have that same grace when you have a able-bodied wife who's doing great. It'll be different. But when you have challenges that present themselves, God promises he will give you grace sufficient for the trial that he allows. And so that's a helpful reminder rather than an unhelpful reminder of what you deserve.
And I think maybe a more biblical approach to that would be that, hey, Parker, our bodies cannot do everything all the time. And maybe it would be good to consider rest. God does allow for rest, biblically.
Yes.
So make sure that you aren't discounting the fact that God has given us limitations and that rest sometimes is what he's called you to do in that moment. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, that's totally a great answer. So just think about, for example, we all know this on an airplane. What do they tell you? Right? When the oxygen mask comes down, you've got to put your oxygen mask on first. You won't do anybody any good if you pass out. And so, like you just said there, that's a great example. Okay, Parker, it's not the message is not you deserve better, but the message is you need to make sure you get proper rest so that you can continue to serve your wife in her time of need. So how can we jump in and help lighten your load just a little bit to give you a little bit of reprieve so you can get back at it? That would be the kind of, I think, helpful response, because then it becomes, that kind of fits with Galatians 6:2, where we bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. So allowing others to jump in and kind of lighten the load just a little bit so you can rest properly, so you can get back at it, that becomes a helpful message, a helpful reminder. Because again, if you're serving so much and lacking sleep and not eating properly, then you become impaired, and then you're no longer able to help somebody else in their time of need if you're not healthy yourself or taking care of yourself. And so that's the balance.
How do you think somebody can know when if you think about the self-help, kind of going along with this, how do you know when you've went too far on I'm taking care of myself because I'm not mentally okay, and maybe there's some truth to that, right? So is there any wisdom in terms of navigating, hey, maybe you've overshot a little bit too much and you got a mask on, you're good. You don't need 5 masks,
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'll stay away from the 5 mask thing. That was nice. But anyway, yeah, I understand your point. I think just allowing, so a couple thoughts come to mind. First thought that comes to mind is it is okay and even good and right and proper to be tired because you're busy serving the Lord. If you're never tired, you're probably not working hard enough. If you're never tired, you're probably not serving enough people. And so if you're never tired and you're so well rested, you never have any idea what it's like to be tired, that's a problem. You're probably not serving hard enough. But if you are serving and you are exhausted because you are serving, then there's finding this, getting some rest. And then just like we've said in other topics, getting perspective from people who know and love you, allowing them to speak into the situation would be another helpful thing. So again, kind of summarizing, if you're not tired at all ever, you're not serving enough. If you are resting and you are rested enough, and then you're wondering, am I not doing enough? Then you can allow other people to speak into the situation to kind of help you gauge, are you doing all you can be doing, or is there more you could be doing? And I think that can be helpful to have. Proverbs 11:14 reminds us there's safety in the abundance of counselors. So if we're not sure, getting outside help from friends can be helpful.
That's good.
So I think we talked a little bit about how to put to death pride. And I think maybe you touched on some of the overarching principles on how to build up humility or how to grow in humility. Can you get us a little bit more nitty gritty? I tend to be a person who really appreciates practical. If you were sitting down with me and just saying, hey, Hope, I really think that you should work on putting off pride, but also putting on humility. What does it look like to intentionally stop and say, I want to grow in this area of humility?
First thought that comes to mind immediately is spending time, encouraging somebody who's asking that question, whether it's you or somebody else, to really spend time in Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 through 11. So it really does describe, Jesus on the cross is humility in action, but Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 through 11 is humility described. And so I would want to encourage you to read through that passage over and over and over again, and then go to the old, there's a phrase I use in counseling, a biblical word that's often not talked about in Christianity enough, and that's the word meditation. And so reading this passage and then meditating on it, even memorizing portions of it, or maybe even the whole passage, Philippians chapter 2, 3 to 11. But it starts out in a verse I've quoted numerous times, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others more important than yourselves. And so this idea of I'm constantly challenging myself and meditating on that reality. Am I thinking about other people as more important than me? Am I only, verse 4 is about looking out for your own interests only. Am I only looking out for my own interests, or am I actually looking out for the interests of other people? And so this becomes your meditation to be thinking about. And then it reminds us, of course, that Jesus humbled himself and was obedient to death, even death on a cross. And therefore, as a result of that, God highly exalted him and gave him the name that is above every name. So when we humble ourselves, the picture is God exalts us. And then the opposite is also true. When we exalt ourselves, God's going to humble us. And so just spending time in Philippians 2, 3-11, and really reading it over, maybe even memorizing some of it. But the purpose of that is to meditate on it, to mull it over, to think about it, to wrestle with it. So in moments of temptation, I'm calling those verses to mind to remind me of what God has said to me, to help me to overcome the natural tendency every single last one of us has towards pride and selfishness. And so that'd be a real practical thing. And then a second thing that comes to mind is just being really mindful of serving other people, right? Serving other people. You know, there's at churches, I haven't seen this much anymore, but churches when I was younger, you know, it would say like, enter to worship, depart to serve. After a long day of work, it's really easy to think I should be able to put my feet up and read the newspaper or click on my phone and not have to serve anybody, but that's just not biblical. And I need to be ready to enter to serve. And so those are the kind of things that I'd be doing, and I have tried to do, and certainly haven't done it perfectly, but I've tried to do to really grow and overcome and fight against, again, the natural tendency we all have toward pride.
As you're saying all of those things, I just think, like, it's funny how when you do that, it seems like it's why it's a constant problem, right? Because the more you serve, I know sometimes in my heart I can find myself thinking, man, I serve a lot, and then there's that I deserve, and why doesn't anybody else serve me? And you become acutely aware of how much you're doing that other people aren't doing, or right, or so just kind of keeping, I don't know, it makes me think, the more that you, it's just a kind of a constant balance of being vigilant.
Well, and here's the other thing to even think about. So even if you say, for example, you are serving, and you're exhausting yourself serving, and your spouse, I'm not talking about you now, Hope, but your spouse is not serving in return in any way. What you don't want to be thinking, I deserve, that's selfish and prideful again. But I can be thinking, my spouse is not loving very well right now. She's not loving and serving in a way that I think would be beneficial for her and her own walk with God. I'm going to talk to her, not about her serving me, because that could be selfish, but I want to talk to her about, is she serving in the ways that she should right now? And so that's easy to misuse. It's easy to be selfish, but if you're serious about loving people well, again, back to faithful are the wounds of a friend, we've got to be willing to confront somebody, but we're confronting them for their good so that they honor the Lord, not so I get what I want.
One of the things that you've talked with us about in the past, specifically when it comes to parenting situations, or that I've heard you talk about, probably even more than you've talked with us personally about, is teaching our kids to think about their thoughts or to recognize their thoughts. What does it look like when you're talking about pride and humility? What does it look like to learn how to recognize our thought patterns that are leading us into pride?
Yeah. And so 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 5 reminds us we're to take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. And so it's just that, like you said, it's a very important challenge. If we're going to grow as Christians, if we're going to grow as people, we have to pay attention to our thoughts, because our thoughts lead to our actions. And so it's really just asking yourself, what am I thinking right now? It's asking yourself, what am I wanting? What am I thinking and feeling and wanting in these moments? And forcing yourself to identify, to answer in words what it is you're thinking and feeling and wanting. And so that you can then examine that and evaluate that. Does that honor Christ? Is that biblical? Am I thinking rightly about this? Or am I actually thinking selfishly? And so just paying attention to your thoughts is a hugely important aspect of growing in Christ-like character. And then asking yourself the hard questions. Who am I serving right now? Am I thinking about others is more important than myself? It's okay to have rest. It's okay to take time off. It's okay to, clean your house for a little while and then say, I've served enough, it's time to rest before I go to bed. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's just a matter of, am I intentionally using my time? That may be the way to say it. Am I intentionally using my time? Am I intentionally using my life to be a blessing? But also part of being a blessing is properly resting, like we already covered. And so it's not that we serve and never rest, because God didn't make us that way either. And so, but it is being mindful of what it is I'm thinking and feeling, and then comparing that against Scripture, comparing that against the example of Christ, and really trying to help overcome our natural tendency. If we kind of put our minds in neutral, we will think selfishly. And so it's fighting against that constant current by paying attention to our thoughts, so we don't do what comes natural, which is sinfulness and selfishness.
What do you think is for some reason, as you were saying that, I'm thinking about venting, and venting is a way of processing thoughts. Is there a way to humbly vent?
Humbly vent. Well, the first thing that came to mind when you said vent was Proverbs 29:11, which says, a fool gives full vent to his anger, but a wise person keeps himself under control. So that was my first reaction. I think venting is sinful because you're unleashing your anger or your irritation, and it's not controlled. But if you're talking about sharing your frustrations with somebody or sharing your concerns, I think that can be very appropriate. And why are you doing that? You might be doing that because you want your spouse, for example, to understand your struggle at work, or you want to help your child understand why you made the decision that you made that they don't like. And so those can be good reasons to share your frustration or share something. I just probably wouldn't use the word venting because of the connotation it typically has with uncontrolled anger or unleashed anger, if you will.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
One other question for you, and I don't know, I'm a mom, so at the end of the day, a lot of questions come back from me to my kids. What does it look like to help my kids grow in humility, put to death pride, because they're little sinners, right? Like, you don't have to teach them how to have pride, but you don't want to squash their view of, like, devalue them either, right? Like, you want them to have an appropriate view of their value, but teach them how to grow in humility. Any tips for parents on how to help your kids grow in humility?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So first of all, you always want to make sure your kids know you love them. And the best way to do that is spend time with them. For kids, this is not original with me, but love is spelled Time for kids. So you got to make time for your kids. There's no substitute. Don't make excuses. Make time for your kids. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing I would say is you really have to help kids to see their sin. You have to help them see they fell short of God's perfect standard. One of the, children are naturally prideful, we've been talking about, so they don't naturally see their sin. So oftentimes parents become angry when their children misbehave, and they just reprimand them and yell at them. And all the kids notice is the parents' anger, and they don't really notice what they did wrong. And so being patient to expose and ask questions to draw out the hearts of our kids so that they can see their sinfulness, and then give them the good news of the gospel that God forgives sinners like us who struggle with anger or disobedience or grumbling and complaining or whatever the sin is. Help them to see that sin and then actually own it. And so you want to be able to it ought to be a regular occurrence in every Christian home where children and parents are asking each other for forgiveness. That's one of the best ways to grow in humility. See, if you think you never do anything wrong, well, of course you're going to become prideful. But if you realize every day or two or three you're confessing sin, it's like, wow, I don't really have anything to be prideful of. I make mistakes all the time. But, oh, by the way, God is so gracious and forgiving and merciful. This is a great God. I sin all the time and he still loves me. This is amazing. And so now we're growing in humility, first by loving them and helping them to know that they're important and they're precious, but then second by helping them to see their sin, and then third by giving them the gospel that Jesus forgives sinners who repent. And I think that's a way to keep us all humble, is this regular confession of sin in your home, so that we all know we fall short, but also that we're reminded that God loves and forgives.
Really
I think you would agree with this too. One of the things that I've enjoyed recently being back able to interact with my kids is being able to pray with them before bed, right? And I'm sure we talked about how if you're not praying, you're not humble, and hearing my children pray and being able to walk with them and pray for them in those moments of like, hey, God, this child is really struggling with using harsh words. Could you help them to speak kindly? God, this child is struggling with having self-control of their emotions. Could you help them? Like, displaying that neediness before God for them and asking him for help so that they can also realize like, oh, this is part of the way that I should be interacting with God, not even in the moment of like, hey, I just wronged somebody, but as a regular habit of their day. And again, I'm sure that you would agree with that because you were talking about it, but that was one other thing that came to mind as you were talking about that regular habit of confession is also that habit of prayer and asking God for help for those things with them. It's been a really cool thing for me to see recently with them as I've been able to do it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, absolutely. Very important. We want to teach our kids to pray, and we want to teach our kids to ask for forgiveness. And when our kids are young, when they have to ask for forgiveness, we often are modeling that prayer for them and letting them repeat after us until they're old enough to pray their own prayers.
One of the things we would say is that it's pray and watch. If you pray and don't watch, you will likely miss that God might have done something. And oftentimes, you miss it. So as I look back on our story and I think about kind of maybe building the discipline of learning to see. So actually what I was thinking is that the sovereignty of God plays such a role, I feel, in humility, because if you really look back and you think, wow, God did that and God did that, and you give proper attribution to who did what was done, you will see a lot of God. And then it was a lot easier to be like, wow, well, I don't know how I got here, but God. And I think I've had moments in my life where I've said it's God, and I really didn't totally, I knew it was the right answer, but I didn't understand. And I think I'm growing in my recognition of really believing, like, I'm not just saying this, I mean it. Like, I don't know how we got here. I don't know how this happened. I don't know how did Hope get better? Well, I don't know.
It's good practice to look and to watch and to observe and then praise and worship him and give thanks to him as we go through the inevitable journeys of life. And just a reminder, of course, that God never promised us a perfect life. He didn't promise everything would go smoothly this side of heaven. John 16:33, in this world you will have trouble, you will have tribulation. And so when we all face those tribulations, we need to remember the things that we're talking about to help us endure the trials and difficulties that we all face.
Man, thanks for being here with us on episode 3. It's been a lot of fun hanging out, and I feel like I've learned a lot. This is really encouraging.
Yeah, my privilege to be here for sure. Anytime.